There is a specific, quiet arrogance that precedes the death of an empire. It is the dangerous illusion that the rules of the world have not changed, that the power you wielded yesterday will naturally be yours tomorrow. For centuries, the empires of Europe believed they were the architects of the global order. They drew borders on maps they had never visited, crowned kings in nations they barely understood, and controlled the choke points of the world's economy with an iron fist. By the middle of the 20th century, despite the devastation of 2 world wars, the capitals of London and Paris still clung to the belief that they were the masters of the geopolitical universe. But empires do not always die on blood-soaked battlefields at the hands of their sworn enemies. Sometimes they are quietly, ruthlessly dismantled by their best friends. This is the story of the week the world changed forever. It is the story of a brilliantly cynical military conspiracy, a sudden geopolitical earthquake, and a humiliating defeat that did not come from a rival superpower, but from an ally. To understand how the age of European imperialism truly ended, we must travel back to the summer of 1956, to a world gripped by the paranoia of the Cold War, where the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a staring contest with nuclear weapons.
But the catalyst for this monumental shift did not come from Washington, and it did not come from Moscow. It came from the sweltering streets of Cairo, driven by the sheer audacity of a single, charismatic leader who decided to call the bluff of the most powerful nations on earth. His name was Gamal Abdel Nasser. To the Arab world, he was a messiah. To the governments of Britain and France, he was a dangerous, unpredictable menace. Born to a post office worker in Alexandria, Nasser was a man who understood the profound humiliation of living in a country ruled by shadows. For decades, Egypt had been a sovereign nation in name only. It had a king, but the king was a puppet. The true master of Egypt was the British Empire, which maintained a massive military presence on Egyptian soil for one single overriding reason: the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal was not just a marvel of 19th century engineering, it was the absolute center of global commerce, the great artery of the world. Carved through the Egyptian desert, it connected the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea, cutting the journey between Europe and Asia by thousands of miles. For the British, it was the spinal cord of their empire, the vital link to India and their dominions in the East. But by the 1950s, its importance had shifted to something even more critical: oil.
2/3 of all Europe's oil supply flowed through that narrow strip of water. Without the Suez Canal, the factories of Britain would grind to a halt, the lights of Paris would go dark, the economies of Western Europe would suffocate in a matter of weeks. And yet, this vital waterway, dug by the blood and sweat of tens of thousands of Egyptian laborers, did not belong to Egypt. It was owned and operated by the Universal Company of the Suez Maritime Canal, a fabulously wealthy corporation controlled almost entirely by British and French shareholders. The profits flowed to London and Paris, while the ships sailed straight through the heart of impoverished Egypt. Nasser despised this reality. In 1952, he had led a clandestine group of young military officers in a bloodless coup, overthrowing the decadent King Farouk and expelling the British military from their bases in the Canal Zone. Nasser was a new kind of leader for a new kind of world. He was fiercely nationalist, highly intelligent, and a master of the newly emerging art of mass media. When he spoke on the radio, millions of people across the Middle East stopped what they were doing to listen. His voice carried the promise of dignity, of a unified Arab world throwing off the shackles of colonial subjugation. He did not want Egypt to be a pawn in the Cold War. He envisioned himself as a leader of the non-aligned movement, an independent force that could play the Americans and the Soviets against each other to get exactly what it wanted. And what Nasser wanted, more than anything else, was to drag Egypt into the modern age.
To do this, he needed a miracle of engineering. He needed the Aswan High Dam. It was a colossal infrastructure project designed to tame the mighty Nile River, generate massive amounts of hydroelectric power, and provide irrigation that would revolutionize Egyptian agriculture. It was the key to Nasser's promise of prosperity. But a project of this magnitude required a staggering amount of capital, money that Egypt simply did not have. Initially, the United States and Great Britain agreed to finance the dam. President Dwight D. Eisenhower's administration saw the funding as a way to keep Nasser firmly within the Western sphere of influence, preventing him from drifting toward the Soviet Union. But Nasser was playing a dangerous game. Believing he could outsmart the superpowers, he formally recognized Communist China, a move that infuriated Washington. Furthermore, he negotiated a massive arms deal with Czechoslovakia, effectively purchasing Soviet weapons using Soviet credit. Nasser thought he was brilliantly leveraging his strategic position.
John Foster Dulles, the stern, fiercely anti-communist American Secretary of State, saw it differently. To Washington, Nasser was engaging in geopolitical blackmail. In July of 1956, Dulles decided to teach the Egyptian leader a lesson in economic reality. With the stroke of a pen, the United States abruptly and publicly withdrew its offer to fund the Aswan Dam. Britain immediately followed suit. It was a calculated insult designed to humiliate Nasser in front of the entire world. The Western powers expected him to quietly swallow his pride, realize his absolute dependence on Western capital, and come crawling back to the negotiating table. They severely misjudged the man, and they profoundly misjudged the era. Nasser was enraged, but beneath the anger was a cold, calculating, strategic mind. He knew that showing weakness would destroy his credibility in the Arab world. He needed a masterstroke. He needed a source of revenue to build his dam, and he needed a victory to solidify his power. He looked at the map. The answer was flowing quietly right through his own country, generating millions of dollars a year for European shareholders. On the evening of July 26, 1956, exactly 1 week after the Americans pulled their funding, Nasser stood before a massive crowd of 250,000 people in Munshia Square in Alexandria.
Millions more were glued to their radios from Baghdad to Algiers. He began to speak. For over 2 hours, he delivered a masterclass in political rhetoric. He talked about the history of Egypt, the blood of the workers who had died digging the canal, the arrogance of the Americans, and the greed of the European imperialists. The crowd was mesmerized, laughing at his jokes and roaring at his defiance. But as Nasser spoke, something else was happening in the shadows. He had secretly ordered battalions of the Egyptian army and police to move quietly toward the offices and installations of the Suez Canal Company. They were waiting for a signal. In the middle of his speech, Nasser began to tell a story about a meeting he had with the former director of the canal company. He casually dropped the name of the French engineer who had built the canal a century earlier, Ferdinand de Lesseps. That was the code word. The moment Nasser said the name de Lesseps, Egyptian commandos kicked down the doors of the canal company offices in Port Said, Ismailia, and Suez. They seized the ledgers, took over the communication rooms, and raised the Egyptian flag over the installations. Back in Alexandria, Nasser leaned into the microphone, his voice echoing over the roar of the crowd. He announced that the Suez Canal Company had been nationalized. The canal now belonged to the people of Egypt.
Its revenues would be used to build the Aswan Dam. The era of European exploitation was over. The crowd erupted into absolute delirium. The shockwave of that speech radiated outward, rattling the windows of power in London, Paris, and Washington. Nasser had not just taken over a waterway, he had reached out and grabbed the British and French empires by the throat. The panic in Europe was instantaneous and overwhelming. In London,
Prime Minister Anthony Eden received the news while hosting a dinner for the King of Iraq. Eden was a man deeply burdened by history. He had made his name as a diplomat in the 1930s by opposing the appeasement of Adolf Hitler. Now, his worldview was entirely calcified by that experience. When Eden looked at Gamal Abdel Nasser, he did not see an anti-colonial nationalist trying to modernize his country. He saw a Middle Eastern Mussolini. He saw a fascist dictator taking his first expansionist steps. Eden became absolutely convinced that if Nasser was allowed to keep the canal, it would be the Munich Agreement all over again. The Middle East would fall, the oil would be cut off, and Great Britain would be reduced to a second-rate island nation. It was a matter of imperial survival. Nasser had to be destroyed.
Across the English Channel, the French government was experiencing an identical sense of existential dread, but for entirely different reasons. France was bogged down in a brutal, agonizing colonial war in Algeria. The French military was fighting a desperate counterinsurgency against Algerian nationalists, who were fighting for their independence. The French Prime Minister, Gamal, firmly believed that the Algerian rebellion was not a genuine popular uprising, but a proxy war, funded, armed, and directed by Gamal Abdel Nasser from Cairo. To the French, Nasser was the head of the snake. If they could chop off the head in Egypt, the rebellion in Algeria would wither and die. In a matter of days, a dark and powerful synergy formed between London and Paris. They shared a common enemy, and they shared a common goal: regime change in Cairo. But there was a problem. Nationalizing a company, even one as vital as the Suez Canal, was not technically illegal under international law, provided the shareholders were compensated, which Nasser had promised to do. The Egyptian government was managing the canal perfectly well. Ships were passing through without interruption. There was no legal justification for a declaration of war. Throughout the late summer and early autumn, diplomats scrambled to find a peaceful resolution. International conferences were held in London.
Proposals were drafted. The United Nations was engaged. The American Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, flew back and forth across the Atlantic, trying to cool the tempers of the British and the French. President Eisenhower made it abundantly clear to his European allies the United States would not support a military intervention. Eisenhower was a former five-star general who had commanded the Allied forces in Europe during World War II. He knew the horrors of war intimately, and he recognized the shifting tides of history. He knew that the age of colonialism was over, and he believed that a heavy-handed Western invasion of an Arab country would only push the entire Middle East directly into the waiting arms of the Soviet Union. Furthermore, Eisenhower was in the middle of a fiercely contested re-election campaign. The last thing he wanted was a major global conflict erupting just weeks before the American people went to the polls. Eisenhower believed his allies were listening to him. He trusted that the special relationship between the United States and Great Britain would prevent London from doing anything reckless. He thought diplomacy was slowly working its way toward a compromise. He was completely wrong.
Behind closed doors, out of sight of the press, the public, and most importantly, out of sight of American intelligence, the British and French were constructing one of the most cynical, elaborate, and dangerous geopolitical conspiracies of the 20th century. They had realized that diplomacy would never give them what they wanted: the head of Gamal Abdel Nasser. If they wanted to take back the canal and topple the Egyptian government, they would have to do it by force, and if there was no legitimate excuse for a war, they would simply have to invent one. To make their plan work, London and Paris needed a third partner. They needed a nation that had its own deep-seated grievances against Egypt, a nation capable of launching a lightning-fast military strike that would throw the region into chaos. They found the perfect accomplice in the young state of Israel. Israel in 1956 was a nation living under a state of permanent siege. Since its creation just 8 years earlier, it had been surrounded by hostile Arab neighbors who refused to recognize its existence. For months, Egypt had been sponsoring raids by armed militants, known as Fedayeen, across the border into Israeli territory.
attacking farms and civilian settlements. Furthermore, Nasser had blockaded the Straits of Tiran, cutting off Israel's only southern shipping route.
For the Israeli Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, and his brilliant eye-patch-wearing military commander, Moshe Dayan, a preemptive war against Egypt wasn't just an opportunity, it was a strategic necessity. The massive arsenal of Soviet weapons Nasser had recently purchased terrified the Israeli high command. They believed that if they did not strike soon, Egypt would eventually build a military machine capable of wiping Israel off the map. In late October, the conspiracy moved from whispered conversations to concrete action. Deep in the French countryside, in a secluded villa in the Parisian suburb of Sèvres, highly classified meetings took place. The attendees arrived in unmarked cars, their identities hidden. Present were the foreign ministers of Britain and France, alongside the top leadership of Israel, including Ben-Gurion himself. Over the course of 3 days, operating in absolute secrecy, they hammered out a remarkably deceptive master plan. They drafted a document known as the Protocol of Sèvres. The plan was a masterpiece of military theater. It was essentially a choreographed fake war. According to the protocol, Israel would launch a massive surprise armored invasion of the Sinai Peninsula, racing across the desert directly towards the Suez Canal.
This sudden outbreak of hostilities would create a terrifying global crisis, a perceived threat to the safety of the world's most important shipping lane. At that exact moment, Britain and France would suddenly step onto the world stage, presenting themselves not as aggressors, but as neutral peacekeepers. They would issue a joint ultimatum to both Israel and Egypt, demanding that both armies pull back 10 miles from the canal to allow an Anglo-French military force to occupy the zone and protect international shipping. The conspirators knew perfectly well that Israel, being in on the plot, would readily agree to the ultimatum. They also knew, with absolute certainty, that Gamal Abdel Nasser would never agree to withdraw his own troops from his own sovereign territory. When Nasser inevitably rejected the ultimatum, Britain and France would have the perfect, legally plausible excuse they had been waiting for. They would declare that Egypt was a threat to global peace, launch a massive aerial bombardment to destroy the Egyptian Air Force, and send thousands of paratroopers and Royal Marines to seize the canal and, ultimately, march on Cairo to drag Nasser from power. It was a brilliantly woven trap. The logistics were flawless. The military hardware was primed. The narrative was perfectly constructed to bypass the United Nations and present a fait accompli to the world.
The British and the French firmly believed they were about to execute a strategic masterstroke that would secure their empires for another century. They believed they were proving to the upstart nations of the developing world that the old masters of Europe still held the whip hand. But in their hubris, in their desperation to cling to their fading imperial glory, Prime Minister Eden and Prime Minister Mollet had made a catastrophic miscalculation. They had suffered a fatal failure of imagination. They were so fixated on destroying the man in Cairo that they entirely forgot about the man sitting in the Oval Office. They assumed that once the troops were on the ground and the bullets were flying, the United States, their oldest and closest ally, would have no choice but to grimly accept the situation and support them. After all, the Western alliance was supposed to be unbreakable. They did not understand that the world had already shifted beneath their feet. They did not realize that by deceiving the President of the United States, they were about to awaken a sleeping giant that cared absolutely nothing for their imperial nostalgia. As the late October sun set over the Mediterranean, Israeli tanks were fueling up on the border of the Sinai. British and French bombers were quietly loaded with munitions on airfields in Cyprus and Malta.
The Armada was preparing to sail into the dark. The conspirators smiled, believing they had orchestrated the perfect crime. They had no idea that they had just signed the death warrant of their own empires. At exactly 5 o'clock in the afternoon on October 29, 1956, the silence of the Sinai Desert was shattered by the roar of low-flying aircraft. High above the desolate sun-baked landscape of the Mitla Pass, hundreds of Israeli paratroopers tumbled from the doors of transport planes, their parachutes blooming like white flowers against the deepening twilight.
Far to the north, highly mobile columns of Israeli armor smashed across the Egyptian border, their tracks churning the sand as they raced westward at breakneck speed. Operation Kadesh had begun. Driven by a desperate need to secure their borders and crush the Egyptian military infrastructure that had tormented them, the Israeli Defense Forces, under the brilliant and aggressive command of Moshe Dayan, executed a masterclass in mechanized blitzkrieg. The Egyptian army, caught completely off guard, fought fiercely in isolated pockets, but they were rapidly overwhelmed by the sheer velocity and coordinated violence of the Israeli advance.
Within hours, the Sinai Peninsula was ablaze, and the meticulously crafted conspiracy forged in the shadows of that secluded Parisian villa was suddenly thrust into the glaring light of the world stage. In London and Paris, the architects of this secret war watched the intelligence reports roll in with a profound sense of self-congratulation. The trap had been sprung. The first phase of the plan was unfolding perfectly. Now it was time for the theater. The following day, British Prime Minister Anthony Eden stood before the House of Commons. Looking impeccably tailored and projecting an aura of grave statesmanship, Eden informed a stunned Parliament and the listening world that a sudden and terrifying war had broken out between Israel and Egypt. Feigning absolute surprise and deep concern for global security, he announced that this conflict threatened the safety of the Suez Canal, the vital artery of global commerce. Therefore, he declared, the governments of the United Kingdom and France had no choice but to intervene, not as partisans, but as neutral arbiters of peace. Eden announced that a joint Anglo-French ultimatum had been issued to both belligerents. Israel and Egypt were given exactly 12 hours to cease all hostilities and withdraw their forces 10 miles from either side of the Suez Canal.
Furthermore, Egypt was ordered to allow British and French forces to temporarily occupy key positions along the canal in Port Said, Ismailia, and Suez to separate the combatants and guarantee the free passage of international shipping. To the untrained eye, it sounded like a noble, desperate attempt to prevent a regional war. But to anyone with a map and a basic understanding of geopolitics, the ultimatum was an absolute absurdity, a demand of staggering, transparent hypocrisy. The Israeli army was still dozens of miles away from the canal, fighting its way through the desert. The ultimatum effectively authorized the Israelis to continue their advance deep into Egyptian territory while simultaneously demanding that the Egyptian army retreat from its own sovereign soil, abandoning its own defensive lines, and handing over the crown jewel of its infrastructure to the very imperial powers it had just expelled. In Cairo, Gamal Abdel Nasser listened to the ultimatum, and the full, horrifying reality of the situation crystallized in his mind. He was not just facing a border skirmish with Israel, he was the target of a massive, coordinated invasion by 3 heavily armed nations. The European empires had come back to reclaim their property and to destroy him.
Nasser knew that his military, still modernizing and heavily reliant on newly delivered Soviet hardware they barely knew how to use, stood no chance in a conventional war against the combined might of the British and French war machines. But Nasser was a man who thrived on defiance. He understood something that the men in London and Paris fundamentally did not. True power in the mid-20th century was no longer decided solely by who had the biggest guns, but by who controlled the narrative. When the 12-hour deadline expired on October 31st, Nasser officially rejected the ultimatum. He would not surrender Egyptian sovereignty. He would fight. The response from Europe was immediate and devastating. Operation Musketeer was launched. Swarms of British Royal Air Force and French Air Force bombers, flying from bases in Cyprus and Malta, darkened the skies over Egypt. They unleashed a relentless, crushing bombardment on Egyptian airfields, communication centers, and military barracks. Within 48 hours, the Egyptian Air Force was almost entirely wiped out, its brand-new Soviet MiG fighters reduced to burning, twisted metal on the tarmac before they could even take off. With absolute air superiority secured, an immense Anglo-French naval armada appeared off the Egyptian coast, the largest assembly of European naval power since the Second World War.
Thousands of heavily armed British and French paratroopers dropped into the city of Port Said, while amphibious landing craft disgorged Royal Marines onto the beaches. The urban combat was brutal. The Egyptian army, reinforced by civilians armed with rifles handed out from the backs of trucks, fought a desperate, bloody house-to-house resistance. But the technological and numerical superiority of the invading forces was overwhelming. Tactically, militarily, the operation was a triumph. The British and French were successfully seizing the Canal Zone, and the road to Cairo lay tantalizingly open. Eden and his French counterpart, Gamal, believed they had pulled it off. They believed they had turned back the clock, reasserted European dominance, and put the upstart Egyptian president in his place. But as the bombs fell on Cairo and the paratroopers secured the docks of Port Said, Nasser executed a brilliant, asymmetric countermove that completely neutralized the entire stated purpose of the European invasion. If the British and French were coming to take the Suez Canal, Nasser decided he would make sure the canal was completely useless to them. He issued a quiet, desperate order.
Up and down the 100-mile length of the waterway, Egyptian engineers detonated explosives on dozens of block ships, dredgers, and cement-filled barges, sinking them directly into the navigable channel. In a matter of hours, the great artery of the world was choked shut. The flow of oil to Europe stopped dead. The very catastrophe that Britain and France claimed they were intervening to prevent, they had just directly caused. Nasser had sacrificed the canal to save his country, and in doing so, he plunged the economies of Western Europe into immediate peril. Yet the sinking of the ships, the bombardment of the airfields, the blood spilled in the streets of Port Said, none of this was the true turning point of the Suez Crisis. The event that would shatter the world order was not happening in the sands of Egypt. It was unfolding in a silent, deeply tense room on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. When the news of the Israeli invasion and the subsequent Anglo-French ultimatum reached Washington, D.C., the reaction inside the Oval Office was not merely surprise. It was a cold, terrifying, apocalyptic fury. President Dwight D. Eisenhower was handed the intelligence reports by his fiercely loyal and equally stunned Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles. As Eisenhower read the transcripts of Eden's speeches and the reports of the bombings, the scales fell from his eyes. He realized instantly what had happened. He had been lied to. He had been played. His closest allies, the nations he had fought alongside to liberate Europe just a decade earlier, had secretly plotted a massive military aggression, deliberately keeping the United States in the dark, and launched it just days before the American presidential election. Eisenhower was a man who valued loyalty and transparency above all else. He felt a profound, burning sense of personal betrayal by Anthony Eden. But his anger was not just personal. It was deeply, strategically terrifying. Eisenhower's fury stemmed from the catastrophic geopolitical context of the exact moment Britain and France chose to launch their imperial adventure. To understand Eisenhower's wrath, one must look away from the Middle East and cast their eyes toward Eastern Europe. In the very same week that Israeli tanks rolled into the Sinai and British bombers hit Cairo, a massive, bloody revolution had erupted in the streets of Budapest. The people of Hungary had risen up against their Soviet-backed communist government, demanding freedom and democracy. In response, the Soviet premier, Nikita Khrushchev, had ordered thousands of Soviet tanks and troops to pour into Hungary to crush the rebellion with merciless brutality. For Eisenhower, the Hungarian uprising was the ultimate propaganda victory for the free world. It was the perfect opportunity to stand before the United Nations and condemn the Soviet Union as a ruthless, imperialist aggressor, to show the developing nations of the world that communism was a system maintained only by the barrel of a tank gun. The United States was perfectly positioned to claim the absolute moral high ground in the Cold War. And then, at that exact, critical, historic moment, the British and the French decided to invade Egypt, to seize a canal and overthrow a government. Eisenhower was paralyzed by the staggering hypocrisy of his allies. How could the United States condemn the Soviet Union for crushing the sovereignty of Hungary when America's closest friends were simultaneously bombing the sovereignty out of Egypt? The moral high ground evaporated overnight.
The Western Alliance looked just as imperialistic, just as violent, and just as greedy as the Kremlin. Eisenhower realized with chilling clarity that Eden and Malay, in their desperate obsession with Gamal Abdel Nasser, were about to push the entire Arab world and potentially the whole of Africa and Asia directly into the waiting arms of the Soviet Union. The British and French were not just jeopardizing a canal, they were jeopardizing the entire global architecture of the Cold War.
I've just never seen great powers make such a complete mess and botch of things, Eisenhower reportedly raged to his aides. He immediately picked up the transatlantic telephone. The calls between the White House and number 10 Downing Street during those crucial days remain some of the most brutal diplomatic exchanges in modern history. Eden, sweating under the immense pressure of a war he was rapidly losing control of, tried to employ the old charm, appealing to the special relationship, framing the invasion as a necessary policing action to stop a dictator. Eisenhower cut him off. The president's voice was ice. He demanded an immediate ceasefire. He demanded that Britain and France halt their advance and pull their troops back. He warned Eden that the United States would not protect them from the consequences of their own deceit. But Eden, tragically trapped in the inertia of his own conspiracy, could not stop. The troops were already on the ground. The prestige of the British Empire was entirely committed. To pull back now would mean the end of his government and the total humiliation of Great Britain on the world stage. He stalled. He offered excuses. He hoped that once the canal was fully secured and Nasser was deposed, the Americans would simply accept the new reality and move on.
It was at this moment, with the Western Alliance fracturing, that the Soviet Union realized it had been handed the greatest geopolitical gift of the century. Nikita Khrushchev, currently bathed in the blood of the Hungarian Revolution, saw a brilliant opportunity to deflect global attention away from his own atrocities and position himself as the great protector of the Arab world. Moscow decided to escalate the Suez Crisis from a regional conflict into a terrifying global standoff. On November 5th, as British and French troops fought their way through Port Said, diplomatic cables arrived in London, Paris, and Washington that sent a shockwave of absolute terror through the halls of power. The messages were from Khrushchev. They were blunt, aggressive, and unmistakable. The Soviet premier accused Britain and France of unprovoked aggression and threatened catastrophic consequences if they did not immediately withdraw from Egypt. Khrushchev casually noted that the Soviet Union possessed a vast arsenal of long-range ballistic missiles capable of carrying nuclear warheads. He warned that London and Paris were well within range. If the invasion of Egypt did not stop, Khrushchev heavily implied, the Soviet Union was prepared to launch nuclear strikes against the capitals of Western Europe to restore peace. Suddenly, the world was holding its breath.
What had begun as an arrogant colonial land grab had mutated in a matter of days into a genuine threat of World War III. Air raid sirens were tested in London. The public panic was palpable. In a desperate bid to force the issue, the Soviet Union even proposed a joint military operation with the United States to intervene in Egypt and repel the British and French forces. Eisenhower was disgusted by the Soviet hypocrisy, but he was also acutely aware of the danger. He immediately rejected the idea of a joint U.S.-Soviet military operation, knowing it would mean allowing Soviet troops into the heart of the Middle East, a strategic nightmare. He ordered the Pentagon to place the Strategic Air Command on high alert, a clear signal to Moscow that any nuclear strike on Europe would be met with total American retaliation. But Eisenhower was caught in a terrifying vice. He had to deter a Soviet nuclear attack on his allies, while simultaneously forcing those same allies to abandon their invasion. In the United Nations Security Council, the drama reached its absolute zenith. The United States, acting with unprecedented diplomatic ruthlessness, drafted a resolution formally demanding an immediate ceasefire and the withdrawal of all foreign forces from Egypt. It was a stunning moment. The leader of the free world was officially bringing the hammer down on its own partners.
Desperate to protect their operation, Great Britain and France did something they had never done before. They used their veto power in the Security Council to kill the American resolution. It was a massive, public rupture of the Western Alliance. But the United States would not be defied. Using a procedural maneuver known as the Uniting for Peace resolution,
Washington bypassed the deadlocked Security Council and took the issue to the General Assembly, where no vetoes existed. There, in a historic and overwhelming vote, the nations of the world, led by the United States and ironically supported by the Soviet Union, overwhelmingly condemned the Anglo-French-Israeli invasion. Anthony Eden was now completely isolated. Militarily, his troops were winning. They had secured a foothold in the Canal Zone and were preparing to break out and march south. But politically, diplomatically, and morally, he was utterly bankrupt. Half the world was condemning him. The Soviet Union was threatening to obliterate his country with nuclear weapons, and his own people were deeply divided, with massive anti-war protests erupting in Trafalgar Square. Yet, even in the face of universal condemnation and the threat of nuclear annihilation, the imperial pride of London and Paris held firm. They stubbornly believed they could ride out the storm. They believed that as long as they held the physical ground in Egypt, they held the cards. They believed the United States, despite its diplomatic fury, would never actually take concrete action to destroy the economies of its closest friends. They were wrong. They fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the man in the Oval Office, and they misunderstood the new reality of American hegemony. Eisenhower realized that diplomatic condemnations and UN resolutions were not enough to pierce the thick armor of European imperial arrogance. If Eden and Molled were going to play a ruthless game of geopolitical hardball, Eisenhower was prepared to show them what true, unadulterated superpower leverage looked like. The military phase of the Suez Crisis was drawing to a close, but the true war, the invisible war that would ultimately shatter the empires of Europe forever, was just about to begin. Eisenhower reached out not to his generals, but to his Secretary of the Treasury. He was about to unleash a weapon far more devastating than the bombs dropping on Cairo. He was about to initiate a synchronized, catastrophic assault on the very lifeblood of the British economy. The trap that Britain and France had set for Gamal Abdel Nasser was about to violently snap shut on their own necks, and the United States was holding the trigger.
Great Britain in the autumn of 1956 was a nation living on a magnificent, dangerous illusion. To the average citizen walking the streets of London, the country was still a superpower, victorious in the Second World War and holding dominion over a vast global commonwealth. But inside the mahogany-paneled rooms of the Treasury, the reality was stark, terrifying, and completely undeniable. The British Empire was practically bankrupt. The sheer, exhausting cost of fighting Nazi Germany had bled the nation's wealth dry. The British economy was kept afloat by a fragile system of international reserves, heavily dependent on the stability of the pound sterling. And it was exactly this glaring vulnerability that President Dwight D. Eisenhower decided to target with absolutely ruthless precision. If the British and French governments would not listen to the language of diplomacy, they would be forced to listen to the language of money. The catastrophic genius of Gamal Abdel Nasser's decision to block the Suez Canal was now becoming painfully apparent to the economies of Western Europe. By sinking dozens of ships in the navigable channel, Nasser had completely severed the primary artery of Middle Eastern oil. Suddenly, the factories of the English Midlands and the power plants of France were facing an immediate, paralyzing fuel shortage.
To prevent an industrial collapse, Britain had to instantly pivot and purchased vast quantities of oil from the United States and Venezuela. But this emergency oil could not be bought with British pounds or French francs. It had to be purchased with United States dollars. As panic swept through the global financial markets, international investors and currency speculators took one look at the chaotic military adventure unfolding in Egypt, looked at the looming oil crisis, and began a massive, relentless sell-off of the British pound. Britain's gold and dollar reserves began to hemorrhage at an apocalyptic rate. In the first few days of November, the Bank of England was losing tens of millions of dollars a day, trying to artificially prop up the value of its currency. It was an unsustainable bleed. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, Harold Macmillan, who had initially been one of the most aggressive cheerleaders for the invasion of Egypt, looked at the treasury ledgers and experienced a sudden, chilling epiphany. He rushed to Prime Minister Anthony Eden with a devastating mathematical truth. At the current rate of financial hemorrhage, Great Britain was less than 2 weeks away from total insolvency. The pound would collapse, the country would be unable to import food or fuel, and the economy would plunge into a depression. There was only one way to stop the bleeding.
Great Britain desperately needed a massive, emergency financial bailout from the International Monetary Fund to stabilize the pound and weather the storm. It was a standard procedure for a nation in crisis, and London confidently assumed the funds would be released. But the International Monetary Fund, then as now, was fundamentally dominated by the United States. When the British request for a lifeline arrived in Washington, Eisenhower gave his Secretary of the Treasury, George Humphrey, a simple, devastating order: block it. The United States government officially informed London that it would veto any attempt by Great Britain to draw upon its IMF reserves. Furthermore, the Eisenhower administration quietly but unmistakably let it be known that if the invasion of Egypt did not halt immediately, the United States Treasury was prepared to sell off its own massive holdings of the British pound on the open market. It was a financial nuclear option. If the Americans dumped their sterling, the currency would be completely annihilated. The message from Washington was brutally clear. The United States was holding a financial gun to the head of the British economy, and Eisenhower's finger was on the trigger. There would be no IMF loans, there would be no American oil to replace the shortfall, there would be no economic salvation.
Not one single cent would flow across the Atlantic until every single British and French soldier stopped shooting and agreed to leave Egyptian soil. In London, the realization of what was happening struck the British cabinet like a physical blow. The invincible armor of imperial pride shattered in an instant. The military reality on the ground in Egypt made the humiliation infinitely worse. The Anglo-French invasion force was actually winning the tactical war. General Charles Keightley's troops had successfully captured the northern end of the Suez Canal. British tanks were rolling out of Port Said, preparing to punch southward down the causeway to take the rest of the canal zone. The Egyptian army was retreating. The road to Cairo and to the political destruction of Gamal Abdel Nasser was agonizingly close. But it did not matter. The supreme geopolitical truth of the mid-20th century had suddenly revealed itself. Military victory was entirely meaningless if you did not have the economic permission of the United States to achieve it. On November 6th, a physically exhausted, emotionally broken Anthony Eden picked up the telephone to call the French Prime Minister, Gamal. Eden informed his co-conspirator that Great Britain could no longer sustain the operation. The economic strangulation was too severe. The pound was collapsing.
The British government was unilaterally declaring a ceasefire at midnight. The French were absolutely incandescent with rage. The military commanders in the field begged for just 48 more hours to finish the job, promising they could secure the entire canal. The French government, less vulnerable to the immediate currency crisis and deeply desperate to crush Nasser to save their empire in Algeria, pleaded with Eden to stand firm. But Eden was a beaten man. Without British logistical support, without the Royal Air Force, and without British financial backing, the French military was entirely paralyzed. They had been dragged into a conspiracy by the British, and now they were being abandoned by them. With bitter, lingering resentment, the French had no choice but to agree to the ceasefire. At midnight on November 6th, less than 48 hours after the first British paratroopers had landed in Egypt, the guns fell silent. The armored columns halted in the sand. The operation was over. They had captured less than a quarter of the canal. Nasser was still in power. The waterway was still blocked. The grand imperial adventure had completely collapsed, not because of the Egyptian army and not because of Soviet nuclear threats, but because the President of the United States had quietly closed his checkbook.
The aftermath of the ceasefire was a masterclass in American diplomatic engineering. Having broken the will of his allies, Eisenhower now moved to physically dismantle their presence in the Middle East. At the United Nations, a groundbreaking diplomatic solution was engineered by the Canadian Secretary of State for External Affairs, Lester B. Pearson. To provide a face-saving mechanism for the British and French to withdraw and to separate the Israeli and Egyptian forces, the United Nations created something the world had never seen before: a large-scale, armed international peacekeeping force. The United Nations Emergency Force, wearing their soon-to-be iconic blue helmets, was rapidly deployed to the Canal Zone. Under the humiliating gaze of the international community, the proud British and French regiments were forced to pack up their equipment, board their transport ships, and sail away from Port Said. It was an excruciating, highly visible retreat. For the British, the psychological impact was devastating. The withdrawal from Suez was the definitive, undeniable visual confirmation that the sun had finally set on the British Empire. Israel, however, proved much more stubborn. Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion had achieved his military objectives brilliantly.
The Egyptian army in the Sinai was destroyed, and Israeli troops were occupying the entire peninsula, all the way down to the strategic straits of Tiran. Ben-Gurion declared that Israel would not surrender the territory it had conquered. He believed the Sinai was the ultimate buffer zone against future Egyptian aggression. But Eisenhower was not finished. He applied the exact same brutal, uncompromising pressure to Israel that he had applied to London and Paris. The president drafted a severe message to Ben-Gurion, warning that if Israel did not withdraw behind the 1949 armistice lines, the United States would initiate devastating UN sanctions. More terrifyingly, Eisenhower threatened to sever all private American financial assistance to Israel, including the massive flow of tax-exempt donations from American citizens that the young Israeli economy desperately relied upon to survive. Recognizing that alienating the United States was a suicidal strategy for a nation surrounded by enemies, Ben-Gurion swallowed his pride. In early 1957, under immense American duress, Israeli forces slowly, reluctantly pulled back across the desert, handing the Sinai Peninsula back to Egypt. The Suez Crisis was a geopolitical earthquake, and when the dust finally settled, the global landscape had been permanently, irreversibly altered.
The casualties of this brief, bizarre war were not just soldiers and civilians. They were entire political careers, grand national illusions, and centuries-old imperial structures. For Prime Minister Anthony Eden, the architect of the disaster, the crisis was completely fatal. His physical health collapsed under the immense stress of the American betrayal and the public humiliation. In January 1957, a broken, discredited man, Eden resigned as Prime Minister and faded into historical obscurity. He had envisioned himself as a modern Winston Churchill, standing up to a new dictator. But history would remember him as the man who accidentally exposed the impotence of his own nation. Great Britain awoke from the Suez Crisis to a harsh, cold reality. It was no longer an independent global hegemon. From that moment forward, British foreign policy would be inextricably, permanently tethered to the strategic desires of Washington. London learned the hard way that it could never again undertake a major international military action without the explicit prior approval of the United States. The special relationship had been violently redefined. It was no longer a partnership of equals, but a relationship between a master and a subordinate. For France, the psychological scars of Suez ran perhaps even deeper.
The French government felt profoundly betrayed, not just by the Americans, but by the British, who had folded under economic pressure and left France stranded in the desert. This deep-seated resentment fundamentally rewired French grand strategy. The leaders in Paris concluded that they could never again rely on the unreliable Anglo-Saxons for their national security. This realization accelerated France's drive for absolute strategic autonomy. It fueled their determination to build their own independent nuclear arsenal, the Force de Frappe. It paved the way for the return of Charles de Gaulle, who would eventually pull French forces out of NATO integrated military command. And crucially, it convinced France that its future lay not in clinging to its dying overseas colonies, but in forging a powerful, tightly integrated European bloc. The humiliation of Suez was the direct catalyst that accelerated the signing of the Treaty of Rome just months later, laying the foundational framework for what would eventually become the European Union. But the true, undisputed victor of the Suez Crisis, the man who walked away from the wreckage as a towering titan of the 20th century, was Gamal Abdel Nasser. Militarily, his army had been routed in the Sinai, and his air force had been pulverized on the tarmac. By all conventional metrics of warfare, Egypt had lost.
But geopolitically, Nasser had achieved an absolute staggering triumph. He had survived a coordinated invasion by 3 heavily armed nations. He had kept control of the Suez Canal. He had forced the empires of Europe to retreat in total disgrace. To the millions of people living across the newly decolonized world, Nasser was not just a president, he was a living legend. He had proven that a developing nation could look the imperial masters in the eye, absorb their best punch, and emerge victorious. He became the undisputed champion of pan-Arab nationalism, a hero from Casablanca to Baghdad. And he got his dam. Following the crisis, with the United States having thoroughly alienated the British and French, the Soviet Union swept in to fill the diplomatic void. Moscow gladly provided the funding, the engineers, and the heavy machinery to build the Aswan High Dam. Nasser had successfully played the superpowers exactly as he had originally intended, securing his nation's modernization while cementing his legacy. The week that British paratroopers fell from the sky over Port Said was supposed to be a triumphant return to the natural order of things. It was designed to be a sharp, violent lesson to the developing world that the empires of Europe still commanded the destiny of the globe. Instead, it became a spectacular, public suicide of imperial prestige.
The Suez Crisis proved definitively that the era of gunboat diplomacy was dead. The old European powers had completely failed to understand that the map had been redrawn. The true power brokers of the planet no longer resided in the palaces of London and Paris, but in the corridors of Washington and Moscow. President Dwight D. Eisenhower had looked at a map of a world on the brink of nuclear war, and he had made a cold, calculated, brilliantly ruthless decision. He chose the stability of the new American-led global order over the imperial nostalgia of his closest friends. In doing so, he executed a geopolitical masterstroke. Without firing a single American bullet, without dropping a single American bomb, Eisenhower used the invisible, suffocating power of the dollar to bring two of the greatest empires in human history to their knees. History is often written as a clash of bitter enemies, a struggle between opposing ideologies fighting for supremacy. But the story of the Suez Crisis leaves us with a far more fascinating and far more terrifying revelation about the true nature of power. Gamal Abdel Nasser challenged the empires of Europe, and he survived. The Soviet Union threatened them with nuclear annihilation, and they stood their ground. But the fatal blow, the absolute destruction of their imperial authority, did not come from their adversaries.
The greatest geopolitical defeat in the history of the British and French empires was delivered quietly and efficiently by their most powerful ally.